Coming up on Government and You are interviews with Bob Quinlan, the City Manager of Cupertino, and Tom Lewcock, the City Manager of Sunnyvale. Also Ruthella Caldwell of the League of Women Voters. So stay tuned for an exciting 30 minutes coming up.
The League of Women Voters of Cupertino Sunnyvale, in cooperation with the City of Cupertino, presents Government and You, a series of monthly programs about city and county government.
Welcome to the second program sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Government and You. With me in the studio today is Ruthella Caldwell, Vice President of the League of Women Voters. Welcome, Ruthella.
Hi, Pat.
We'll be discussing how a city functions. On our last program, Ruthella, we discussed the differences between a charter city and a general law city and what their functions are. Today, I'd like to ask you, are there any differences in the services to citizens of a general law in a charter city?
There aren't any established by law, but it would depend on why the city was incorporated in the first place. A coastal city might have harbor services, but most cities, practically all the California cities, must have planning, and they must, of course, provide police and fire protection, some health measures. It implies that you keep up the streets to get good transportation. You provide a water system, good drinking water. You have a sewer system. Those are the kinds of things that cities offer their citizens.
So to some extent, it depends on why they became a city to begin with.
That's right. What did the citizens want the city to provide that they couldn't get before they became a city?
Right. Some cities do not have their own police department. How are these services provided if they don't have a police department?
Small cities may contract with a county to provide this service, or maybe an adjoining city. If that's a small city close to a larger city that has that capability, then they can contract. They have that power under the California law to contract to get special services.
I see. So if they don't have it within their own city, then they can get it from other sources. Right. I see. With so many of our cities in California having part-time councils and part-time mayors, as you know, the last time we interviewed the mayors from Cupertino and Sunnyvale, they mentioned that they are part-time, and certainly the councils are part-time. Can you tell me who takes care of the daily running of a city when you have a part-time mayor and a part-time council?
We have professionals, and the professional administrator, they're called city managers or a city administrative officer. And this came into being about in the 1970s, when there was a lot of growth in the California cities and people were asking for services, and it just was not possible for part-time people to take a charge of all this. So there are professionals now. They go to city manager school. They become very good administration officials. They know their budgets. They know costs. They know supplies, and they are under the city charters or under the general law, cities from the state. They will hire or appoint, the city council appoints the city manager, and then the city manager hires department heads. It depends on how many departments it takes to run the city, how many professionals you need, public works, public safety, and then he hires and fires all the employees underneath. And then the citizens get into the act and they serve on boards and commissions. So there's a whole structure of government, sort of an organizational flow. The citizens, I should say the electorate, the registered voters, elect the city council. The city council appoints the professional city administrator and a city attorney in both of our cities. And then the city manager finds the best qualified professionals to run the different departments it takes to provide these services that the city wants.
Well, certainly with the size of cities, and in the Bay Area we find many so-called small cities are large, I can see where the need for professional management came about, and that they did need that. With the growth of cities, and in California that's been quite phenomenal, I understand many cities have a general plan, something that controls that growth, and we can look at that. Can you tell me a little about what a general plan is?
Yes, it's a policy statement about what you want the city to look like. Where you're going to put residential, where you're going to put the industry, how are you going to get people from the houses to the jobs, your through traffic, where the parks are going to be, are you going to set aside land for schools. All these things are in a general plan, and that is mandated by California state law, that every city must have a general plan. Every city also must review environmental impact reports now. That's a new thing. And every city must review its capital improvements plan. And if you're observing the City Council of Cupertino or Sunnyvale and see their agendas, you'll see that they are reviewing their general plan about every, 4 or 5 years. And then you will see that developers and citizens want to do something to their property, and that will have to be a process, and it'll have to look at the general plan first. Will it fit with the general plan? Will it follow what the general plan says?
So essentially, you are saying that any city in California that is incorporated must have a general plan, that it's
That's
required
right.
by law. One of the other things, as you're talking about a city having a general plan and the needs there, what is citizen input like in this process? How is that planned for, and how does it occur?
Every city that has a general plan has to, by implication, have a planner and a planning department. Those are professionals, professional staff, but there's also a planning commission in each one of our cities, and those are citizens who serve, volunteer, without compensation. If they are on duty, official duty for the city, and they have to leave the city, they get expenses. But they serve usually for 4-year terms, and the terms are staggered, so there's always somebody who has been there to continue on with the work. And if there are vacancies, there will be advertisement in the newspaper wanting citizens to apply, and then the citizen is interviewed by the city council in public. People who are interested to see who is applying for the job and how they stack up may go,
So
and
you
then
can
they
go-
are appointed.
So you can go down and actually sit in on these. These are public interviews
That's right.
to find out what questions would be asked, if you might be a likely candidate in the future. Gives you an idea then. So citizens are able to do that.
And the Planning Commission can do many of the things they are in Sunnyvale. The charter gives them the power to, say, zoning or some sort of small matter, or I guess what you'd call just a easy matter to attend to, as long as it applies to the law and obeys the law and sticks with the code and all that. They can take care of a lot of things on zoning. And if the developer or the citizen doesn't like it, they can appeal it to the city council, but the city council doesn't have to hear all these small matters. And the Planning Commission is staffed by professionals. The city manager delegates who's going to be at the commission. They have their secretary supplied by the city. They have agendas and minutes prepared and everything by the city. And it's a good way to learn how government works. It's a good stepping stone. And there are other places than the Planning Commission. There's a library board in each city. There's a personnel board in Sunnyvale.
So let me just stop right there for just a second. So you're telling me that as a citizen, I would be able to serve, or at least apply, for any of these commissions in a city. How would I find out these are open?
You could call a city clerk. I know in Sunnyvale the appointments come due about July, and you'll find advertisements as early as April and May in the newspapers, so that you can get your application in and they can set up the interviews and all that. And you're allowed to serve 2 4-year terms, and then you have to take a 2-year vacation before you can apply for any other commission.
I see. Now, for instance, if I were reading the newspaper one evening and I would notice that there's an opening on a commission, that would be at that point I'd be ready to call the city clerk to let them know I was interested. What about other places? Is there any place else that citizens might find out that there's an opening, for instance, on a commission?
Just call a city clerk if you don't have a newspaper, of the local newspaper that those ads are in.
Or maybe
but call
even
the
the
city
library.
clerk or the library. Yes, the library will post that. And your city hall, if you have a lobby in the city hall, that will often post that, what positions are open. And it's a great place for to get an appreciation of how hard it is to make decisions in the interest of the public. You find out that there are a lot of demands made on the city's resources.
Well, I certainly thank you for all the information that you've given us today. And this gives us an idea of how citizens can participate and how a city functions. So I thank you very much.
Thank you, Pat.
We've all had the problem of who to call when we have a cracked signal light, a pothole in the street, or even a question about foreign policy. With so many layers of government, who do we contact? In our next segment, our question and answer segment, we'll try to answer those questions for you.
Dear government and you, please tell me why a state law can affect one city and not affect another. I live in the city of Sunnyvale and just found out that I can't vote on tax increases in my city because Proposition 62 doesn't affect us here. If Prop 62 was passed as a state law, why doesn't it apply to Sunnyvale as well? I don't get it.
Dear viewer, there's an explanation to this, but it's not exactly simple. You see, Sunnyvale is a charter law city, which means the California Constitution grants it the power to govern itself. Cupertino, on the other hand, is a general law city. The state government code defines and describes how it governs itself. City Tax Proposition 62 affected the California government code, however, it did not affect the state constitution. Because of this, your city of Sunnyvale, as a charter law city under the Constitution, is exempt from this particular tax measure, and that's why you can't vote on tax increases. If this opens up more questions for you, simply ask your local League of Women Voters. You can also contact your city clerk or the Secretary of State. He or she will be happy to provide you with all the answers you need. Thanks for your question. If you have a question for the staff of government and you, write to us. League of Women Voters, Cupertino, Sunnyvale, care of the City of Cupertino, P.O. Box 580, Cupertino, California, 95015.
Welcome back to Government and You. In our question and answer segment, you were able to find out which agency or department might help you with a problem that you might be having with the city or exactly who to contact with that problem. Now, I'd like for you to meet the city managers of Cupertino and Sunnyvale. Robert Quinlan of Cupertino. Hi, Bob.
Hi, Pat.
And Thomas Lewcock of Sunnyvale.
Hi.
Tom. Really glad that you could take time out of your busy schedules to be with us this afternoon and tell us something about what a city manager does, what your experiences are like, and what your duties are. First of all, I would like to ask you, Bob, why does a city need a city manager?
That's a good question, a tough question. Well, actually, I guess probably the best way to say it is how it got started. There were a number of cities that had difficulties in the early 20s, some corruptness and also very inefficient operations. And the idea of adopting the council manager government kind of followed the typical private sector board, corporate board with a manager, except of course the city manager doesn't own stock in the company, except the house he may own in the incorporated city. This whole idea was conceived from that approach, and then over the years it's been refined and defined in the various states in the country.
So it really could be a counterpart, or people could look at it like a company is operated.
Yes. The theory is to separate administration from policy. The policy people being elected to guide the city and the overall efforts, and then the city managers hired to implement those policies.
Mm-hmm. And so people could get that feeling from noticing how a company works and essentially what it is, the way a city works.
Correct.
And in that structure, you would be the counterpart of which officer in a company?
Well, it'd be the managing director, except in case of the company, like I say, in most cases in the private sector, they own quite a bit of the stock also.
So a big difference there.
That's a big difference, yes.
Yes. Tom, how does a city manager interact with the city council? What are your duties and what is your role there?
Probably one of the most important roles, important one from a perspective that a city manager absolutely must have a very solid and good working relationship with their governing body. That role involves certainly a substantial amount of assistance to council in their policy role, in that the professional staff serves under the city manager as a council's taking a look at whether it's a planning issue or a new ordinance that they want to look at. It's really the city manager's staff that provides the professional advice to a city council around that issue. More importantly, of course, the people who vote for and elect council members do expect that the services in the community will be good, and in that sense it's the city manager's job to make sure those services are good within the bounds of the budget and what the council appropriated for those services, and if problems occur, then there's frequent contact between council members and that manager to make sure that those issues are dealt with. It's, I think, very much unlike most any other structure of government I'm aware of, because as opposed to a true separation of powers and checks and balances, it really works best, I believe, in the situation where true partnerships, professional versus elective, are built over time in any particular city.
You know, Bob, one of the things that Tom mentioned that I think is well worth pursuing is the whole policy role in government and what part the city manager plays in policy. How is policy established in a city, and what role does the city manager have in that establishment of policy?
Well, that'll vary within the city that you're working in and tradition in that particular city, but I, like Tom, believe that you know, we're hired as professionals. We hire professional staff people to assist us, and it's our responsibility to advise and recommend to the council policies. Of course, the final decision is made by the council, and it's as it should be. But we play a major role in providing the information, background information necessary for them to have all the facts they need to make a good decision.
One of the things I'd like to ask you, Tom, is the cities, many of the cities have some really unusual projects right now as a result of the planning and some of the work that we mentioned earlier, the commissions and council have done. Some of the cities have some very nice civic projects that are going on now. What's happening in Sunnyvale?
Well, sometimes it's difficult to do that simply, but we've just completed a very significant round of capital improvements in the community. A renovated library, new public safety building, changes to our city hall building, changes to our corporation yard facility. We've literally changed and improved all of our facilities, bringing in earthquake standards, providing better facilities for our citizens.
Bob, could you tell us what some of the particular civic projects are that are happening in Cupertino now?
Well, if you've driven on our city streets lately, you'll know there's a lot going on. We have a number of projects going on to do with our transportation corridors. We have, as a matter of fact, this year about triple of what our normal capital improvement program is and has been. We have, as I said, a number of streets being widened, improved to accommodate the traffic based upon our general plan. All these things have been calculated, needs have been calculated in our general plan, and so those items that are being done now are in conformance to the general plan. Also, we have a remodeling of the City Hall and somewhat of an expansion within the existing building confines to utilize the lower level of the City Hall. Also an expansion of the library and a plaza to be developed in between those two. We hope to get underway very quickly on that, or very shortly. We're taking bids the first part of December, and if those are within our cost analysis, well, then we'll proceed with that. We also are involved now in just starting on a community center. The site has been chosen, actually chosen some time ago, regarding at Memorial Park at the corner of Stelling. And we now will be meeting with citizen groups in that area to try to develop the center in such a manner that it will mitigate any nuisance factors that might occur from the opening of that center. And that will be starting very shortly.
Would like to mention something you talked about earlier, Tom, and that is a public safety department that you have in Sunnyvale. How does that differ from other cities, and do they have public safety departments?
Most do not. Our public safety department was established in 1950. It was the first in the nation to try to do what we did. And back in those days, the city was quite small compared with its present population. And in fact, fire services were provided by a volunteer department. The city fathers at that time saw the obvious, that was the community was going to grow rapidly. And they essentially came up with the idea of providing a joint police and fire department wherein all officers are trained in both functions. All people brought into our department are both sworn California law enforcement officers and are fully trained as firefighters as well. The notion behind that was that it could provide equally good services at a lower cost, and in fact we found that to be the case over the years. Essentially the monetary savings comes because we have fewer people in our firehouses than the average fire department would be, because all of our law enforcement patrol-based personnel are fully trained as firefighters. And if there is a major structure fire, they are responded to that fire scene. They open the trunk of their car, they put on their firefighting gear, they attack the fire. When it's out, they go back on routine patrol again. It also provides the advantage, since we rotate our people. They are not permanently police officers or permanently firefighters. On the average, every third year they rotate from the firehouse to patrol strengths to provide an opportunity of some differences in their life career, and also a tremendous opportunity, if we ever have a major law enforcement problem or a major fire problem, to have a good deal more trained people we can bring to bear at a given time, since we can use all of those resources as either police or fire should we need to.
So you have some very talented people in that department that can fulfill more than one role. And how does that work in the city of Cupertino, Bob?
Well, we contract for our police services with the sheriff's department at the county, and we are in a fire district. The Central Fire District provides the fire service for our community, as well as some of the other communities here on the west side. We've done several studies. The most recent one is about 3 years ago now, to determine what would be the most cost-effective way to provide the services. And to this date, at least, we found that it's a little more economical to go the way we've gone. There, of course, are some advantages and disadvantages to contracting for services. But at least from a cost standpoint, at this stage of the game, we think it's more cost-effective for us to do what we're doing.
Would like to ask you if there are any other areas that the city of Cupertino uses contract services. Is this the primary one?
Oh no,
or are there others?
We've contracted out custodial services. That's about 10 years ago now. We made a study of it at that time and decided that was the way to go. We contract out certain cleanup services on the weekends in our parks. We now contract out street sweeping. We periodically make an analysis of what we're doing and then try to check with the private sector to see if they can do it more cost effectively. And in those cases that we've contracted out, that's what we found to be the case.
And so you found there's certain advantages, certain times that you find advantages
Depends
on contract
on
services.
what you're doing and what kind of competition there is out there. But yes, in the case of custodial service, we found it much to our advantage to go to the private sector.
Are there any areas, Tom, that Sunnyvale finds that they use contract services and that is the best way to deliver services?
We make a great deal of use of contract services. A bit of a distinction, though, between Cupertino and Sunnyvale, and that is we are not served by any special districts. All city services are under the aegis of the city, as opposed to, for example, sanitary sewer collection and treatment, which is, I think, done through a special district in Cupertino. It's done by our city. We don't have a fire district. We don't have a library district. But within the fold of the fact that our city does all of those things without other governmental agencies, we attempt to look at contract services wherever we believe they can afford the same level and quality of service at a lower cost. And as a result, there's a wide number of areas all the way from traffic signal maintenance to custodial maintenance where we choose to do that.
One of the things that we have talked about in this program is differences between general law and charter cities. And of course, Cupertino is a general law city and Sunnyvale a charter city. Bob, for you as a city manager, do you see any differences in working for a city that's a general law city as different from a city that might be a charter city? Does that make a difference to a city manager?
Well, it does right now, especially with the passage of Proposition 62, which, as you know, was the proposition in which now there's required a vote of the people, simple majority, to approve any new taxes that are non-special taxes. That is to say that will just go into the general fund and are not earmarked. In the adoption of that proposition, the cities that are charter cities are not under that same requirement. Up to that time, the gap between general law cities and charter cities had narrowed considerably from a standpoint of taxes. General law cities had been able to adopt almost the same number of tax resources as had charter cities. I guess the other change is the fact that under a charter city you can pretty well tailor-make what your citizens want in your community as to how they're represented. You can have any number of council members, you can have any way that you want to select them. You can have direct election of the mayor. You can have that in a general law city too, I might add. But there are just a number of ways that you can tailor your council body to the needs of that community if the community so desires. Whereas in general law city, you're somewhat more restricted.
Mm-hmm. Tom, I don't know, many city managers have worked for different cities and may have had the experience of both general law and charter cities. Do you have any comments to make on the differences that you see as a city manager between those two forms?
Yes, and I've worked under both systems,
I
so
see.
I've had experience on both sides. One important thing to remember is that the issue of charter versus non-charter cities differs dramatically from one state to the other, since it's essentially the state that dictates the form that local governments will take. And in California, essentially, charter cities are provided for in the Constitution, in the state Constitution. And without getting too specific, essentially charter cities can do most anything they wish to do without being fettered by what the state government chooses to do, unless the state legislates something of statewide importance. The rules for general law cities are essentially the opposite, and that is a charter or a general law city may do what state statutes allow them to do. So we're allowed to do anything that we're not restricted to do, whereas general law cities can do only that which is specified. That makes a big difference not only in taxation and in organization, it also makes a big difference in legislation. There are areas that we are allowed to legislate in that a general law city is not allowed to legislate in. So I think from that perspective, the charter gives a local community a great deal much more flexibility in my judgment in taxation, organization, and policy setting. On the other hand, that does not necessarily mean that those powers are exercised at all times. And I would think from an everyday city manager perspective, if you have a general law city under the city manager form and a charter city under the city manager form, the everyday, what the job looks like from a city manager's perspective on an everyday basis does not change that much.
Well, these have been fascinating kinds of responses that you've made to a number of questions. I know you're both professionally trained men, professionally trained in being city managers, and you gave us a good history on that, Bob. I thank you both for being here this afternoon because, as I mentioned earlier, I know that you have a pretty busy schedule most every day, even though I'm sure it's an enjoyable job. Thank you very much for coming here.
Thank you.
You, Pat.
Today on Government and You learned how a city functions. You learned how you can become involved in your city, and you've also learned what the duties of a city manager are. Please send us your comments and questions to Post Office Box 580, Cupertino, California 95015. We would like for you to watch our next segment. I'm Pat Jackson, and thank you for watching.